She thought she was fighting for her father's life. She had no idea someone else was already calculating his cost. 27 years of sacrifice, duct-taped boots, sold tools, a whole life spent building hers. And this is what it was worth to him. He gave up everything and never once asked for anything back. He still doesn't know what she just found. You knew he was sick. You knew I needed him. Why did you do this?
Silence.
Tell me. Tell me why you betrayed me. She spent her whole life keeping a promise to her father. Tonight, she finally understood who truly deserved to keep it.
If you have ever sacrificed everything for someone you love, only to wonder if it mattered at all, this story will break your heart and then rebuild it. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel, because what happens in the next 40 minutes will stay with you long after the video ends. Stay until the very last scene, because the ending is not what you think it is. His name was Arthur Bellamy, and on the night his wife died, he made a promise to a crying infant that he had no idea how to keep. He was 34 years old, a mechanic with grease permanently pressed into the creases of his knuckles, and he stood in a hospital hallway holding a bundle of blankets that contained his entire future. The doctor who delivered the news about his wife had used words like complications and nothing more we could do, but all Arthur heard was silence roaring in his ears. He looked down at his daughter, barely 6 hours old, and whispered the only thing he could think to say, "I don't know how to do this, but I promise you, Eleanor, I will never let you feel alone." He named her Eleanor after her mother. It was the one thing he was certain of amid the chaos of grief and diapers and a nursery that was still half-painted because he and his wife had planned to finish it together that weekend. Instead, he finished it alone, rollers squeaking against the wall at 2 in the morning, while a newborn slept in a bassinet beside him, because he refused to let her out of his sight even for an hour. The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. Arthur worked at Denny's auto shop 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when money was tight, and he came home every evening smelling of motor oil and determination. He learned to braid hair from a video he watched on his lunch break, badly at first, so badly that Eleanor's kindergarten teacher gently pulled him aside one day and showed him a better technique. He learned to cook more than eggs and toast, because a growing girl needed vegetables, and he learned to sew a button back onto a school uniform with hands that were built for wrenches, not needles. What he never had to learn was how to love her. That came as naturally as breathing. Eleanor grew up watching her father's hands. She watched them fix engines, patch drywall, and hold her steady during nightmares. She watched them shake slightly with exhaustion after a double shift, and she watched them tremble with pride at every school assembly where her name was called for another award. By the time she was 8 years old, she had already decided what she wanted to be when she grew up. She wanted to fix people the way her father fixed cars. She wanted to be a doctor. "You sure about that, kiddo?" Arthur asked one evening, sitting on the porch steps of their small rented house while Eleanor sketched a stethoscope on the back of a math worksheet. "Doctors gotta go to school for a real long time. Like, a long, long time." "I know," Eleanor said, not even looking up. "I'm going to do it anyway. And when I'm a doctor, you won't have to work so hard anymore, Daddy. I'll take care of you." Arthur laughed, but something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't have a name for yet. He ruffled her hair and told her that was a deal, and he meant it as the kind of thing parents say to make children smile. He did not yet know that this small promise, spoken by an 8-year-old on a porch step, would become the axis around which the next 2 decades of his life would turn. Money was always the quiet, persistent worry in their household. Arthur never let Eleanor see the bills stacked on the kitchen counter, never let her hear the phone calls with collection agencies, never let her know that some months he skipped his own dinner so there would be enough for her school supplies. He wore his old work boots until the soles were paper thin rather than buy new ones, because new boots cost $80, and Eleanor needed a graphing calculator for freshman year algebra that cost exactly that much. When Eleanor turned 16, she started noticing things she had been too young to notice before. She noticed the hole in her father's boot that he covered with a strip of duct tape. She noticed he never bought himself new clothes, that his one good shirt for parent-teacher conferences had been pressed and repressed for a decade. She noticed the way he counted change at the grocery store, quietly, so she wouldn't hear the coins clinking with worry. "Dad, you don't have to do all this," she told him one night, finding him asleep at the kitchen table with a stack of overtime paperwork in front of him. "I could get a part-time job. Help out." Arthur startled awake, blinking at her with the particular tenderness of a man who has never once regretted a single sacrifice. "Absolutely not," he said, more firmly than she'd ever heard him speak. "Your job right now is school. That's it. That's the whole job description. I've got the rest handled." But Eleanor Rose Bellamy. He used her full name, which he only did when he needed her to really listen. "I made a promise to your mother, and I made a promise to you, back when you were 8 years old drawing stethoscopes on homework. You're going to be a doctor. I'm going to make sure of it, even if it means I work until my hands fall off. Don't you dare take that away from me by feeling guilty about it. Let your old man do this one thing right." Eleanor cried that night, not from sadness, but from a love so large it frightened her. She promised herself, silently, fiercely, that she would make every sacrifice worth it. She would become the doctor her father believed she could be, and then she would spend the rest of her life taking care of him the way he had taken care of her. High school passed in a blur of honor roll certificates and late-night study sessions, with Arthur bringing her tea at 11 at night and sitting quietly beside her just so she wouldn't there alone while she studied, even though he understood nothing about the biology textbooks spread across the table. When the acceptance letter to a prestigious university's pre-med program arrived, Eleanor screamed so loud the neighbors knocked on the door to check if everything was all right. Arthur read the letter 3 times, and then he went into the bathroom and cried for the first time since his wife's funeral, quietly, so his daughter wouldn't hear. The tuition, even with scholarships and grants, was staggering. Arthur sold the one thing he had left from his marriage that held any real value, a small collection of tools that had belonged to his own father, tools he had planned to pass down someday. He picked up a second job on weekends at an auto parts warehouse, stocking shelves until midnight. He refinanced the house. He stopped seeing the dentist. He stopped, essentially, existing for himself at all, and existed entirely as a mechanism for his daughter's future. Eleanor knew some of this, though not all of it. She knew enough to feel the weight of it every single day she sat in a lecture hall. She studied harder than anyone else in her cohort, not because she loved organic chemistry, though she did come to love it, but because she carried her father's decades of sacrifice on her back like a second spine. Medical school was worse in every practical sense, and more meaningful in every emotional one. The debt climbed into 6 figures despite everything Arthur had already poured in. Eleanor took out loans in her own name to spare him further strain, though he still insisted on sending money every single month, an amount that never changed even as his own expenses grew, because he had simply decided long ago that this was non-negotiable. During her 3rd year of medical school, during her surgical rotation, Eleanor met a resident named Marcus Chen, a sharp, ambitious young man from a wealthy family who had never once worried about tuition or duct-taped boots. Marcus was kind to her in the specific way that people who have never struggled can be kind, generously, but without full comprehension. He fell for Eleanor's brilliance and her drive, and she fell for the effortless polish of a life she had never gotten to have. They began dating quietly, then not so quietly, and within a year they were engaged. Arthur met Marcus exactly twice before the wedding, both times at dinners paid for by Marcus's family at restaurants, where Arthur didn't recognize half the words on the menu. He wore his one good shirt, pressed for the occasion, and he shook Marcus's hand with the calloused grip of a man who had built his daughter's entire future with those hands. Marcus was polite. Marcus was, in fact, unfailingly polite in the way that made Arthur feel, without quite being able to articulate why, like a guest in his own daughter's life, rather than the foundation of it. "He's a good man," Eleanor told her father after the second dinner, sensing something unspoken in his silence during the drive home. "You'll see, Dad. He makes me happy." "Then that's all that matters to me," Arthur said, and he believed it, mostly. There was a small, quiet ache underneath his happiness for her, an ache he didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt selfish, and Arthur Bellamy had spent 26 years training himself out of anything that resembled selfishness, where his daughter was concerned. Eleanor graduated from medical school with honors. Arthur sat in the audience in a rented suit, weeping openly and without shame, clapping so hard his palms turned red. When she found him after the ceremony, she threw her arms around his neck the way she had when she was small enough for him to carry on his shoulders, and she whispered into his ear, "We did it. Daddy. We actually did it." "You did it," he corrected her, though his voice cracked on every word. "You did it. I just got out of the way. That's not true, and you know it." They wept together in a college courtyard while other families snapped photographs around them, and for one perfect afternoon, every sacrifice felt not just worth it, but sacred. Eleanor married Marcus 8 months later, in a ceremony paid for almost entirely by his parents, in a venue Arthur privately calculated could have covered 2 more years of his own mortgage. He didn't say this to anyone. He walked his daughter down the aisle in a rented tuxedo, and when the officiant asked who gives this woman to be married, Arthur's voice broke as he said, "Her mother and I do," and for a moment, everyone in the room could feel the ghost of the woman who wasn't there to see this, and the man who had been both parents for 27 years. The reception was elegant, catered, full of people from Marcus's world who spoke easily of vacation homes and stock portfolios. Arthur sat at a table near the back, not out of exclusion exactly, but because that was simply where the seating chart, designed by Marcus's mother, had placed him. He didn't complain. He watched his daughter dance under string lights in a dress that cost more than his monthly salary, and he thought, she's happy, and happy was the only currency he had ever truly wanted to earn for her. Eleanor completed her residency in internal medicine and, within 3 years, had built a thriving private practice on the affluent side of the city, largely bankrolled by Marcus's family connections. She became, by every external measure, exactly what that 8-year-old girl on the porch step had dreamed of becoming. She had a beautiful home, a successful husband, a career that commanded respect, and a waiting room full of patients who trusted her steady hands. Arthur, meanwhile, kept working at Denny's auto shop, even past the age when most men his age were slowing down, because the mortgage he'd refinanced for her tuition still had years left on it, and because, if he was honest with himself, working gave his days a shape that retirement never could. His hands had grown stiffer, his back ached in the mornings now in ways it hadn't before, but he never once called his daughter to complain about it. He didn't want to be a burden on the life she had built. It was around this time that Arthur's health began, quietly, to fail him. A persistent cough that wouldn't clear, fatigue that felt different from the ordinary tiredness of a long shift. He mentioned none of this to Eleanor at first, telling himself it was nothing, that a man his age was entitled to a few aches. It was Denny, his boss and oldest friend, who finally noticed the yellow tinge creeping into Arthur's eyes and physically drove him to urgent care one evening after closing up the shop. The diagnosis, when it came, was a form of liver disease that had likely been developing silently for years, worsened by decades of exhaustion, missed meals, and a body that had simply never been given the chance to rest. The specialist used words like advanced and significant intervention required, and for the second time in his life, Arthur stood in a hospital hallway, hearing news that would reshape everything, except this time, there was no infant in his arms to steady his hands. There was only his phone, and the number he had to decide whether to call. He called Eleanor 2 weeks later, only after Denny threatened to call her himself. Arthur sat in his small kitchen, the same kitchen where he had once counted quarters quietly so his daughter wouldn't rend the Rachel and Selvreewis, and he told her, in the gentlest voice he could manage. Eleanor drove to his house that same night, arriving in scrubs still creased from a 12-hour shift, and she held his test results in her hands with the professional detachment of a doctor and the trembling grief of a daughter, 2 things that had never before been in conflict inside her until this exact moment. She read through the numbers, the enzyme levels, the imaging report, and her medical training told her plainly what her heart didn't want to accept. "You need a transplant evaluation," she said, her voice flat with the particular calm doctors use to keep from shattering. "Soon. This isn't something we manage, Dad. This is something we treat aggressively, right now." "Okay," Arthur said simply, the way he'd always agreed to anything that would make her worry less. "Whatever you think is best." What followed was 18 months that tested every fiber of the bond between them. Eleanor threw herself into her father's care with the same relentless intensity she had once poured into organic chemistry exams. She coordinated with specialists, drove him to appointments between her own patient hours, sat beside his hospital bed during 2 frightening admissions when his condition worsened, and personally researched transplant programs across 3 states, looking for the one with the best outcomes for his specific condition. Marcus, to his credit in those early months, seemed supportive, if somewhat removed, the way people are supportive of situations that don't directly touch their own lives. He offered to help cover costs insurance didn't, made polite conversation during hospital visits, and told Eleanor repeatedly that she was doing everything right. But something began to shift as the months wore on. Eleanor's practice suffered from her divided attention. Patients she had cultivated for years began seeking care elsewhere when appointments were rescheduled too many times. The financial strain of a slower practice, combined with Arthur's mounting medical costs, which even with insurance were substantial, began to press against the comfortable life Eleanor and Marcus had built. Marcus, who had never once had to sacrifice for anything in his adult life, found himself, for the first time, being asked to. The argument started small. A comment about how often Eleanor was at her father's house instead of their own. A remark about how the practice's declining revenue was affecting their long-term financial plans. The vacation home they'd been saving toward. The private school they'd hoped to send their future children to. Eleanor, exhausted from carrying medical charts by day and her father's crisis by night, absorbed these comments with a patience that was slowly, quietly, running out. It was during Arthur's final and most critical hospitalization, when he was placed on the active transplant list, and the family was told a matching liver could come at any moment, day or night, that the true fracture in Eleanor's life revealed itself. Marcus sat her down one evening after she returned from another exhausting day, split between her practice and her father's hospital room. He told her, with the same unshakable calm he used when discussing anything, that he thought it was time she considered what he called realistic limits. Realistic limits on what, exactly? Eleanor asked, too tired to hide the edge in her voice. On this, Marcus said, gesturing vaguely, as though her father's illness were a line item in a budget. On how much of yourself you're giving to a situation that, medically, you know as well as I do, isn't guaranteed to have a good outcome. You're a doctor, Eleanor. You know the statistics on liver transplants at his age, with his other risk factors. I'm not saying stop caring, I'm saying stop drowning. Our practice is suffering. Our marriage is suffering. And for what? A best-case outcome that buys him what? A handful more years? Eleanor stared at her husband as though seeing him clearly for the first time in 6 years of marriage. A handful more years, she repeated slowly, is my father's entire life to me. He gave up everything, Marcus. Everything. So that I could become exactly what I am right now, sitting across from you in this house he could never have imagined for himself. You want me to calculate his worth in actuarial tables? I want you to think about our future, Marcus said, unmoved. Not just his. It was in this same devastating week, while Arthur lay in a hospital bed with monitors tracking every fragile rhythm of his failing body, that Eleanor discovered the full extent of what her husband had truly meant by realistic limits. She found paperwork, quite by accident, tucked into a drawer in Marcus's home office while searching for insurance documents. It was a private consultation with a family attorney, dated weeks earlier, discussing what Marcus's lawyer had termed protective financial restructuring, in the event that Eleanor's father's care continued to, as the document coldly phrased it, deplete shared marital assets, disproportionate to projected medical benefit. Marcus had been quietly moving to protect his own finances from her father's medical costs, discussing divorce contingencies with an attorney, all while her father fought for his life in a hospital 3 miles away, and all while Eleanor herself had been begging every specialist she knew for one more option, one more chance. She confronted him that night, the documents shaking in her hands. Marcus did not deny it. He simply said, with the same maddening composure, I was protecting us. You would have done the same thing, eventually, if you weren't so emotionally compromised. Emotionally compromised, Eleanor repeated, and something in her, something that had been slowly bending under the weight of everyone else's expectations for years, finally, cleanly, broke free instead of breaking down. That man raised me alone after his wife died in front of him. He wore duct tape on his boots so I could have a calculator. He sold his own father's tools so I could go to medical school. He sat outside my door every single night I studied for boards, not because he understood a word of what I was learning, but because he didn't. Want me to feel alone the way he must have felt every single night of his life since Mom died. And you are telling me that his life is a line item you calculated against our vacation home." She packed a bag that night, not out of impulsiveness, but out of a clarity so sharp it felt like the first honest breath she'd taken in years. She moved into a small apartment near the hospital, filed for divorce within the month, and did not look back, not once, not even when Marcus tried, briefly, to apologize in the careful language of a man more concerned with his own image than genuine remorse. 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night, the call came that a matching liver had been found. Eleanor sat beside her father's gurney as they wheeled him into surgery, holding his hand until the last possible moment the orderlies would allow. "I love you, Daddy," she said. "You are not allowed to leave me. We had a deal, remember? I take care of you now." That was always the deal. Arthur, weak but lucid, managed a small smile beneath the oxygen mask. "Best deal I ever made," he whispered, "was the day I decided to keep you." The surgery lasted 9 hours. Eleanor spent every one of them in the surgical waiting room, still in her white coat from a shift she had left mid-patient, to rush to the hospital, refusing food, refusing rest, refusing to let herself believe anything but the outcome she needed. He survived. The surgery was, in the specific and careful language doctors use, a complete success, and the recovery, while long, was steady. The betrayal the title of this story promised was never her father's to give. It came, instead, from a man who mistook comfort for love and mistook sacrifice as something that could be measured and budgeted. And in a strange, painful, transformative way, that betrayal became the very thing that set Eleanor free to become, fully and without division, the daughter her father had spent his whole life quietly hoping she would remain, even as she became a celebrated doctor, not a woman split between two competing worlds, but a daughter who understood, in her bones, exactly where her deepest loyalty had always belonged. Eleanor sold the house she had shared with Marcus and used part of the proceeds to renovate her father's home, the same small house with the porch where an 8-year-old girl had once sketched a stethoscope on a math worksheet. She widened the doorways for his walker during recovery. She built a small clinic room in the converted garage where, twice a week, she saw patients from the neighborhood who couldn't afford the fees at her old downtown practice. Patients who reminded her, in their tired eyes and their worn shoes, of a mechanic who had once counted quarters quietly at a grocery store checkout. Arthur recovered fully within a year, regaining enough strength to putter in the garden, to walk with her along the same streets where he used to carry her on his shoulders, to sit on that same porch, now repainted, watching his daughter's headlights pull into the driveway every evening after clinic hours, exactly the way she had once watched for his truck lights coming home from the auto shop. He never remarried, never needed to, because his life had never been empty in the way people sometimes assumed a widower's life must be. It had been full, entirely and deliberately full, of a single, fierce purpose that had, against every hardship stacked against it, succeeded completely. Eleanor built her practice back up, slower this time, more intentional, taking on fewer wealthy clients, and more of the kind of patients who reminded her why she'd fought her. Patients who couldn't pay much but who needed, desperately, someone who would actually show up for them. Years later, at a small community event honoring local healthcare workers, Eleanor was asked to give a short speech about what had inspired her to become a doctor. She looked out at the crowd, found her father sitting in the third row wearing a new pair of boots she had bought him for his birthday, no duct tape in sight, and she said, simply, "I once made a promise to my father when I was 8 years old, sitting on our porch steps, that when I became a doctor, I would take care of him. It took me a long time, and it cost me things I once thought I couldn't live without, to understand that keeping that promise wasn't a debt I owed him. It was the greatest privilege of my life. He gave me everything he had, not because he expected anything back, but because that is simply what real love does. It gives, without keeping score. And I have learned, the hard way, that anyone who does keep score was never truly giving in the first place." The room applauded. Arthur wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the same calloused hand that had once braided badly imperfect braids, patched drywall at 2 a.m, and held a crying infant in a hospital hallway with no idea how he would manage, only the fierce certainty that he would. After the ceremony, father and daughter walked out into the parking lot together. The way they had walked out of 100 ordinary places over 30 years. School gymnasiums and grocery stores and hospital corridors, side by side, unhurried. The evening air was cool, and somewhere nearby, a car radio played faintly from an open window. Arthur slowed his steps, leaning slightly on the cane he still used out of caution more than necessity, and Eleanor matched his pace without thinking, the way she had learned to do instinctively during his recovery, never rushing him, never making him feel like a burden trailing behind her own hurried life. "You know," Arthur said, looking up at the darkening sky rather than at her, "I used to lie awake some nights, back when you were little, terrified I was getting it all wrong. No mother to guide me, no manual for any of it. I used to think, what if I mess this up so badly, she spends her whole life paying for my mistakes?" Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Dad, look at what you built. Look at who I am, because of you." "You didn't get it wrong. You got it more right than anyone I have ever met. I didn't build a doctor," Arthur said quietly. "I just loved a little girl as hard as I knew how, and she turned out to be brilliant enough to do the rest herself." "That's the same thing," Eleanor said, taking his arm as they continued toward the car. "That has always been exactly the same thing." That night, after driving him home and settling him into his favorite chair on the newly repainted porch, Eleanor sat beside him for a long while in comfortable silence, watching the same street where she had once ridden a second-hand bicycle he'd fixed up himself, painted a color she had begged for, purple with a white basket, because he could not afford a new one, but refused to let that stop her from having exactly the bicycle of her dreams. She thought about how many small, unglamorous sacrifices had built the life she now had, sacrifices that never made it into award speeches or medical school applications, sacrifices that existed only in the quiet space between a father and a daughter who had chosen, over and over again across 2 decades, to show up for each other. She thought, too, about Marcus, and found that she felt no bitterness anymore, only a distant, clean sort of gratitude, because his betrayal had forced her to finally see clearly what she had always, on some level, known. Love that calculates is not love. Love that keeps a ledger is not love. The only love worth building a life around is the kind her father had given her from the very first night in that hospital hallway, unconditional, unmeasured, and utterly without expectation of return. Before she left that evening, Arthur caught her hand at the door. "Eleanor," he said, using her full name only once, softly this time, without the old sternness. "Thank you for keeping the deal." "It was never a deal, Dad," she said, kissing his forehead the way he used to kiss hers. "It was just love, finding its way back to you." If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while imagining it, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there are so many more stories like this one still to tell. And if you have someone in your life who gave you everything without ever asking for anything back, do not wait for a hospital hallway or a hard lesson to tell them what they mean to you. Tell them today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story.